no future fulfillment of the great tribulation of the Gospels. Yes, you read that correctly. The prophecy uttered by Jesus in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 was completely fulfilled in the first century, with no greater future fulfillment to await as some Christian groups do. This is not new, as some go further and assert that the entire Bible ends at 70 AD, including Revelation. That is not my view here. I will focus in this essay on what Jesus actually said in Matthew 24, which applies to Mark 13 and Luke 21 as well. The main eyewitness accounts are from historian Flavius Josephus. The relevant extracts from his accounts are collated nicely at the Bible.ca website, where I have copied them for use in this essay. The entire works of Josephus are widely available on the internet. Matthew 24, 1-3. Departing now, Jesus was on his way from the temple, but his disciples approached to show him the buildings of the temple. In response, he said to them, "Do you not behold all these things? Truly I say to you, by no means will a stone be left here upon a stone and not be thrown down." While he was sitting upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples approached him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your presence and of the conclusion of the system of things?" The disciples admired the structure of the temple, but Jesus sensationally prophesied that it would be destroyed without a single stone being left upon another. The disciples asked him the often quoted three-part question in regard to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem-based system of worship only. Verses 4-14. And in answer, Jesus said to them, "Look out that nobody misleads you, for many will come on the basis of my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You are going to hear of wars and reports of wars. See that you are not terrified, for these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be food shortages and earthquakes in one place after another. All these things are a beginning of pangs of distress. Then people will deliver you up to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be objects of hatred by all the nations on account of my name. Then also many will be stumbled and will betray one another and will hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and mislead many. And because of the increasing of lawlessness, the love of the greater number will cool off. But he that has endured to the end is the one that will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be preached in all the inhabited earth for witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many. Our eyewitness of the events leading up to 70 AD, the year the temple and Jerusalem was completely destroyed, is Flavius Josephus, a renowned historian who describes himself as a Hebrew and a priest in one of his works, The History and Destruction of Jerusalem. This book was completed in 75 AD. Was there false Christ leading up to their destruction? Yes, there was. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 5, Section 2. A false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get up upon the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. Now there was then a great number of false prophets, suborned by the tyrants to impose upon the people, who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting, and that they might be buoyed up above fear and care by such hopes. Now, a man that is in adversity does easily comply with such promises, for when such a seducer makes him believe that he shall be delivered from those miseries which oppress him, then it is that the patient is full of hopes of such deliverance. An extract from Book 20, Chapter 8, Section 6. And now these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness, and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. And many that were prevailed on by them suffered the punishments of their folly. For Felix brought them back, and then punished them. Moreover, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city, and at the distance of 5 furlongs. He said further that he would show them from hence how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls when they were falling down. Nation rising against nation, wars and reports of wars. An extract from the preface, Section 1, The Romans. Whereas the war which the Jews made with the Romans hath been the greatest of all those, not only that have been in our times, but in a manner of those that were ever heard of, both of those within cities have fought against cities, or nations against nations, while some men who were not concerned in their affair themselves have gotten together vain and contradictory stories by hearsay, and have written them down after a sophistical manner. And while those things that were then present have given false accounts of things, and this either out of a humour of flattery to the Romans or of a hatred to the Jews, and while their writings contain sometimes accusations and sometimes encomiums, but nowhere the accurate truth of the facts, I have proposed to myself, for the sake of such as live under the government of the Romans, to translate those books into their Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our own country and sent to the upper barbarians. I, Joseph, the son of Matthias, by birth a Hebrew, a priest also, and one who at first fought against the Romans myself, and was forced to be present at what was done afterwards, am the author of this work. An extract from Book 2, Chapter 18, Section 2, Syrian Conflict. However, the Syrians were even equal with the Jews in the multitude of the men whom they slew, for they killed those whom they caught in the cities, and that not only out of the hatred they bare them as formerly, but to prevent the danger under which they were from them, so that the disorders in all Syria were terrible, and every city was divided into 2 armies encamped one against another, and the preservation of the one party was in their destruction of the other, so their daytime was spent in shedding blood, and the night in fear, which was of the two the more terrible. For when the Syrians thought they had ruined the Jews, they had the Judaizers in suspicion also, and as each side did not care to slay those whom they only suspected on the other, so did they greatly fear them when they were mingled with the other, as if they were certainly foreigners. Moreover, greediness of gain was a provocation to kill the opposite party, even to such as had of old appeared very mild and gentle toward them, for they without fear plundered the effects of the slain, and carried off the spoil of those whom they slew to their own houses, as if they had been gained in a set battle. And he was esteemed a man of honor, who got the greatest share, as having prevailed over the greater number of his enemies. It was then common to see cities filled with dead bodies, still lying unburied, and those of old men, mixed with infants, all dead and scattered about together. Women also lay amongst them, without any covering for their nakedness. You might then see the whole province full of inexplicable calamities, while the dread of still more barbarous practices which were threatened was everywhere greater than what had been already perpetrated. An extract from Book 4, Chapter 6, Section 3, Zealots. And now the commanders joined in their approbation of what Vespasian had said, and it was soon discovered how wise an opinion he had given. And indeed, many there were of the Jews that deserted every day and fled away from the zealots, although their flight was very difficult, since they had guarded every passage out of their city, and slew everyone that was caught at them, as taking it for granted they were going over to the Romans. Yet did he who gave them money get clear off, while he only that gave them none was voted a traitor. So the upshot was this, that the rich purchased their flight by money, while none but the poor were slain. Along all the roads also, vast numbers of dead bodies lay in heaps, and even many of those that were so zealous in deserting at length chose rather to perish within the city, for their hopes of burial made death in their own city appear of the two less terrible to them. But these zealots came at last to that degree of barbarity as not to bestow a burial either on those slain in the city or on those that lay along the roads, but as if they had made an agreement to cancel both the laws of their country and the laws of nature, and at the same time that they defiled men with their wicked actions, they would pollute their divinity itself also. They left the dead bodies to putrefy under the sun, and the same punishment was allotted to such as buried any as to those that deserted, which was no other than death, while he that granted the favour of a grave to another would presently stand in need of a grave himself. To say all in a word, no other gentle passion was so entirely lost among them as mercy, for what were the greatest objects of pity did most of all irritate these wretches, and they transferred their rage from the living to those that had been slain, and from the dead to the living. Nay, the terror was so very great that he who survived called them that were first dead happy, as being at rest already, as did those that were under torture in the prisons, declare that upon this comparison, those that lay unburied were the happiest. These men therefore trampled upon all the laws of men, and laughed at the laws of God, and for the oracles of the prophets they ridiculed them as the tricks of jugglers. Yet did these prophets foretell many things concerning the rewards of virtue and punishments of vice, which, when these zealots violated, they occasioned the fulfilling of those very prophecies belonging to their own country. For there was a certain ancient oracle of those men, that the city should then be taken and the sanctuary burnt by right of war, when a sedition should invade the Jews, and their own hand should pollute the temple of God. Now, while these zealots did not quite disbelieve these predictions, they made themselves the instruments of their accomplishment. An extract from Book 4, Chapter 9, Section 10, Transvestite Plunderers. And now, as soon as Simon had set his wife free and recovered her from the zealots, he returned back to the remainders of Idumea, and driving the nation all before him from all quarters, he compelled a great number of them to retire to Jerusalem. He followed them himself also to the city, and encompassed the wall all round again. And when he lighted upon any labourers that were coming thither out of their country, he slew them. Now this Simon, who was without the wall, was a greater terror to the people than the Romans themselves, as were the zealots who were within it more heavy upon them than both of the other. And during this time did the mischievous contrivances and courage of John corrupt the body of the Galileans, for these Galileans had advanced this John, and made him very potent, who made them suitable requital from their authority he had obtained by their means, for he permitted them to do all things that any of them desired to do, while their inclination to plunder was insatiable, as was their zeal in searching the houses of the rich, and for their murdering of the men and abusing of the women, it was sport to them. They also devoured what spoils they had taken, together with their blood, and indulged themselves in feminine wantonness without any disturbance, till they were saturated therewith, while they decked their hair and put on women's garments, and were besmeared over with ointments, and that they might appear very comely, they had paint under their eyes, and imitated not only the ornaments but also the lusts of women, and were guilty of such intolerable uncleanness that they invented unlawful pleasures of that sort. And thus did they roll themselves up and down the city as in a brothel house, and defiled it entirely with their impure actions. Nay, while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and when their gait was effeminate, they presently attacked men, and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely dyed cloaks, and ran everybody through whom they alighted upon. However, Simon waited for such as ran away from John, and was the more bloody of the two, and he who had escaped the tyrant within the wall was destroyed by the other that lay before the gates, so that all attempts of flying and deserting to the Romans were cut off, as to those that had a mind so to do. food shortages and earthquakes. An extract from Book 4, Chapter 4, Section 5, Earthquakes, etc. And now did the Idumeans make an acclamation to what Simon had said, but Jesus went away sorrowful, as seeing that the Idumeans were against all moderate counsels, and that the city was besieged on both sides. Nor indeed were the minds of the Idumeans at rest, for they were in a rage at the injury that had been offered them by their exclusion out of their city. And when they thought the zealots had been strong, but saw nothing of theirs to support them, they were in doubt about the matter, and many of them repented that they had come thither. But the shame that would attend them in case they returned without doing anything at all so far overcame that their repentance, that they lay all night before the wall, though in a very bad encampment, for there broke out a prodigious storm in the night, with the utmost violence and very strong winds, with the largest showers of rain, with continued lightnings, terrible thunderings, and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth that was in an earthquake. These things were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men, when the system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess that these wonders foreshowed some grand calamities that were coming. An extract from Book 5, Chapter 1, Section 4, Famine. And now there were 3 treacherous factions in the city, the one parted from the other, Eleazar and his party that kept the sacred firstfruits, came against John in their cups. Those that were with John plundered the populace, and went out with zeal against Simon. This Simon had his supply of provisions from the city, in opposition to the seditious. When, therefore, John was assaulted on both sides, he made his men turn about, throwing his darts upon those citizens that came up against him from the clusters he had in his possession, while he opposed those that attacked him from the temple by engines of war. And if at any time he was freed from those that were above him, which happened frequently, from their being drunk and tired, he sallied out with a great number upon Simon and his party, and this he did always in such parts of the city as he could come at, till he set on fire those houses that were full of corn and of all provisions. The same thing was done by Simon, when, upon the others' retreat, he attacked the city also, as if they had, on purpose, done it to serve the Romans, by destroying what the city had laid up against the siege, and by thus cutting off the nerves of their own power. Accordingly, it so came to pass that all the places that were about the temple were burnt down, and were become an intermediate desert space, ready for fighting on both sides, and that almost all the corn was burnt, which would have been sufficient for a siege of many years. So they were taken by the means of famine, which it was impossible they should have been, unless they had thus prepared the way for it by this procedure. An extract from Book 5, Chapter 10, Section 2, Famine. But as for the richer sort, it proved all one to them whether they stayed in the city or attempted to get out of it, for they were equally destroyed in both cases, for every such person was put to death under this pretense, that they were going to desert, but in reality that the robbers might get what they had. The madness of their seditious did also increase together with their famine, and both those miseries were every day inflamed more and more, for there was no corn which anywhere appeared publicly, but the robbers came running into and searched men's private houses, and then, if they found any, they tormented them, because they had denied they had any, and if they found none, they tormented them worse, because they supposed they had more carefully concealed it. The indication they made use of whether they had any or not was taken from the bodies of these miserable wretches, which, if they were in good case, they supposed they were in no want at all of food, but if they were wasted away, they walked off without searching any further, nor did they think it proper to kill such as these, because they saw they would very soon die of themselves for want of food. Many there were indeed who sold what they had for one measure, it was of wheat, if they were of the richer sort, but of barley if they were poorer. When these had so done, they shut themselves up in the inmost rooms of their houses, and ate the corn they had gotten. Some did it without grinding it, by reason of the extremity of the want they were in, and others baked bread of it, according as necessity and fare dictated to them. A table was nowhere laid for a distinct meal, but they snatched the bread out of the fire, half-baked, and ate it very hastily. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 3, Section 3, Famine. Now of those that perished by famine in the city, the number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell a-fighting one with another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. Nor would men believe that those who were dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were expiring, lest anyone should have concealed food in their bosoms and counterfeited dying. Nay, these robbers gaped for want, and ran about stumbling and staggering along like mad dogs, and reeling against the doors of their houses like drunken men. They would also, in the great distress they were in, rush into the very same houses 2 or 3 times in one and the same day. Moreover, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, while they gathered such things as the most sordid animals would not touch, and endured to eat them, nor did they at length abstain from girdles and shoes, and the very leather which belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed. The very wisps of old hay became food to some, and some gathered up fibres, and sold a very small weight of them for 4 attic drachmae. But why should I describe the shameless impudence that the famine brought on men in their eating inanimate things, while I am going to relate matter of fact, the like to which no history relates, either among the Greeks or barbarians? It is horrible to speak of it, and incredible when heard. I had indeed willingly omitted this calamity of ours, that I might not seem to deliver what is so portentous to posterity, but that I have innumerable witnesses to it in my own age. And besides, my country would have had little reason to thank me for suppressing the miseries that she underwent at this time. Delivered up, killed, betrayed, increasing of lawlessness. An extract from Book 4, Chapter 4, Section 3. Now this exit of the messengers was not known either to Ananias or to the guards, but the approach of the Idumeans was known to him, for as he knew of it before they came, he ordered their gates to be shut against them, and that the walls should be guarded. Yet did not he by any means think of fighting against them, but before they came to blows, to try what persuasions would do. Accordingly, Jesus, the elders of the high priests next to Artemis, stood upon the tower that was over against them, and said thus, Many troubles indeed, and those of various kinds, have fallen upon this city, yet in none of them have I so much wondered at her fortune as now, when you are come to assist wicked men, and this after a manner very extraordinary, for I see that you are come to support the vilest of men against us, and this with so great alacrity as you could hardly put on the like, in case our metropolis had called you to her assistance against barbarians. And if I had perceived that your army was composed of men like unto those who invited them, I had not deemed your attempt so absurd, for nothing does so much cement the minds of men together as their alliance there is between their manners. But now for these men who have invited you, if you were to examine them one by one, every one of them will be found to have deserved 10,000 deaths for the very rascality and offscouring of their whole country, who have spent in debauchery their own substance, and, by way of trial beforehand, have madly plundered their neighbouring villages and cities, in the upshot of all, have privately run together into this holy city. They are robbers who by their prodigious wickedness have profaned this most sacred floor, and who are to be now seen drinking themselves drunk in their sanctuary, and expending the spoils of those whom they have slaughtered upon their insatiable bellies. As for the multitude that is with you, one may see them so decently adorned in their armour, as it would become them to be had their metropolis called them to her assistance against foreigners. What can a man call this procedure of yours but the sport of fortune, when he sees a whole nation coming to protect a sink of wicked wretches? I have for a good while been in doubt what it could possibly be that should move you to do this so suddenly, because certainly you would not take on your armour on the behalf of robbers and against a people of kin to you, without some very great cause for your so doing. But we have an item that the Romans are pretended, and that we are supposed to be going to betray this city to them, for some of your men have lately made a clamour about those matters, and have said they are come to set their metropolis free. Now we cannot but admire at these wretches in their devising such a lie as this against us, for they knew there was no other way to irritate against us men that were naturally desirous of liberty, and on that account the best disposed to fight against foreign enemies, but by framing a tale as if we were going to betray that most desirable thing, liberty. but you ought to consider what sort of people they are that raise this calumny, and against what sort of people that calumny is raised, and to gather the truth of things, not by fictitious speeches, but out of the actions of both parties. For what occasion is there for us to sell ourselves to the Romans, while it was in our power not to have revolted from them at the first, or when we had once revolted, to have returned under their dominion again, and this while their neighbouring countries were not yet laid waste? Whereas it is not an easy thing to be reconciled to the Romans if we were desirous of it. Now they have subdued Galilee, and are thereby become proud and insolent, and to endeavour to plead them at the time when they are so near us would bring such a reproach upon us as were worse than death. As for myself, indeed, I should have preferred peace with them before death, but now we have once made war upon them and fought with them. I prefer death with reputation before living in captivity under them. But further, whether do they pretend that we, who are the rulers of the people, have sent thus privately to the Romans, or have it been done by the common suffrages of the people? If it be ourselves only that have done it, let them name those friends of ours that have been sent as our servants to manage this treachery. Hath anyone been caught as he went out on this errand, or seized upon as he came back? Are they in possession of our letters? How could we be concealed from such a vast number of our fellow citizens, among whom we are conversant every hour, while what is done privately in their country is, it seems, known by the zealots, who are but few in number and under confinement also, and are not able to come out of their temple into the city? Is this the first time that they are become sensible how they ought to be punished for their insolent actions? For while these men were free from the fear they are now under, there was no suspicion raised that any of us were traitors. But if they lay this charge against the people, this must have been done at a public consultation, and not one of the people must have dissented from the rest of their assembly, in which case the public fame of this matter would have come to you sooner than any particular indication. But how could that be? Must there not then have been ambassadors sent to confirm their agreements? And let them tell us who this ambassador was that was ordained for that purpose. But this is no other than a pretense of such men as are loath to die, and are labouring to escape those punishments that hang over them. For if fate had determined that this city was to be betrayed into its enemies' hands, no other than these men that accuse us falsely could have the impotence to do it, there being no wickedness wanting to complete their impotent practices, but this only, that they become traitors. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 7, Section 3. So now the last hope which supported the tyrants and that crew of robbers who were with them was in the caves and caverns underground, whither, if they could once fly, they did not expect to be searched for, but endeavoured that after their whole city should be destroyed and the Romans gone away, they might come out again and escape from them. This was no better than a dream of theirs, for they were not able to lie hid either from God or from the Romans. However, they depended on these underground subterfuges and set more places on fire than did the Romans themselves. And those that fled out of their houses thus set on fire into their ditches. They killed without mercy and pillaged them also. And if they discovered food belonging to anyone, they seized upon it and swallowed it down, together with their blood also. Nay, they were now come to fight one with another about their plunder, and I cannot but think that, had not their destruction prevented it, their barbarity would have made them taste of even their dead bodies themselves. Objects of hatred by all the nations on account of my name. Acts 4, verses 1-3. Now while the two were speaking to the people, the chief priests and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them, being annoyed because they were teaching the people and were plainly declaring the resurrection from the dead in the case of Jesus. And they laid their hands upon them and put them in custody till the next day, for it was already evening. Verses 15-18. So they commanded them to go outside the Sanhedrin hall, and they began consulting with one another, saying, What shall we do with these men? Because, for a fact, a noteworthy sign has occurred through them, one manifest to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. Nevertheless, in order that it may not be spread abroad further among the people, let us tell them with threats not to speak any more upon the basis of this name to any man at all. With that they called them and charged them nowhere to make any utterance or to teach upon the basis of the name of Jesus. Chapter 5, verses 16-18. Also, the multitude from the cities around Jerusalem kept coming together, bearing sick people and those troubled with unclean spirits, and they would one and all be cured. But the high priest and all those with him, the then existing sect of the Sadducees, rose and became filled with jealousy, and they laid hands upon the apostles and put them in the public place of custody. The Pharisee Gamaliel cautioned the Sanhedrin not to do away with the apostles by reminding them that false deliverers of the people had arose in the past, but was dispensed with. But if the apostles was from God, the Sanhedrin could actually find themselves fighting against God. Then verse 40 says, At this they gave heed to him, and they summoned the apostles, flogged them, and ordered them to stop speaking upon the basis of Jesus' name, and let them go. After the murder of Stephen, it says in Acts 8, 1-3, Saul, for his part, was approving of the murder of him. On that day, great persecution arose against the congregation that was in Jerusalem. All except the apostles were scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. But reverent men carried Stephen to the burial, and they made a great lamentation over him. Saul, though, began to deal outrageously with their congregation, invading one house after another and, dragging out both men and women, he would turn them over to prison. Chapter 9, 1-2. But Saul, still breathing threat and murder against their disciples of the Lord, went to their high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, in order that he might bring bound to Jerusalem any whom he found who belonged to the way, both men and women. Chapter 12, 1-4. About that particular time, Herod the king applied his hands to mistreating some of those of their congregation. He did away with James, the brother of John, by the sword. As he saw it was pleasing to the Jews, he went on to arrest Peter also. As it was, those were days of the unfermented cakes. And laying hold of him, he put him in prison, turning him over to 4 shifts of 4 soldiers each to guard him, as he intended to produce him for the people after the Passover. Chapter 14, 1-6. Now in Iconium they entered together into the synagogue of the Jews, and spoke in such a manner that a great multitude of both Jews and Greeks became believers. But the Jews that did not believe stirred up and wrongly influenced the souls of people of the nations against their brothers. Therefore they spent considerable time speaking with boldness by the authority of Jehovah, who bore witness to the word of his undeserved kindness, by granting signs and portents to occur through their hands. However, the multitude of the city was split, and some were for the Jews, but others for their apostles. Now when a violent attempt took place on the part of both people of the nations and Jews with their rulers, to treat them insolently and pelt them with stones, they, on being informed of it, fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra and Derbe, and the country round about. Chapter 14, verse 19. But Jews arrived from Antioch and Iconium and persuaded the crowds, and they stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, imagining he was dead. Verses 21-22. And after declaring their good news to that city and making quite a few disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of their disciples, encouraging them to remain in the faith, and saying, "We must enter into the kingdom of God through many tribulations." Persecution under Nero, 64-68 AD. Source: Wikipedia. The first documented case of imperially supervised persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire begins with Nero, 37-68. In 64 AD, a great fire broke out in Rome, destroying portions of the city and economically devastating the Roman population. Some people suspected that Nero himself was the arsonist, as Suetonius reported, claiming that he played the lyre and sang the Sacrificium during the fires. In his annals, Tacitus wrote that Nero was in Antioch at the time of the fire's outbreak, stated that to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians or Christians by the populace. Suetonius, later to the period, does not mention any persecution after the fire, but in a previous paragraph unrelated to the fire, mentions punishments inflicted on Christians, defined as men following a new and malefic superstition. Suetonius, however, does not specify the reasons for their punishment. He just lists the fact together with other abuses put down by Nero. Due to the sparse mentions of persecution under Nero in Roman historiography, Cassius Dio wrote about the Great Vow but did not mention Christians, and lack of evidence that Christians were distinguished from Jews at the time. It has been called a myth by some modern historians. Beginnings of persecutions. Source: BBC. The story of Christianity's rise to prominence is a remarkable one, but the traditional story of its progression from a tiny, persecuted religion to the established religion in the medieval West needs some debunking. Although in the first few centuries AD, Christians were prosecuted and punished, often with death, there were also periods when they were more secure. Secondly, the rise of Christianity to imperial-sponsored dominance in the 4th and 5th centuries, although surprising, was not without precedent, and it spread hardly as inexorable as contemporary Christians portrayed it. Christians were first and horribly targeted for persecution as a group by the Emperor Nero in 64 AD. A colossal fire broke out at Rome and destroyed much of the city. Rumors abounded that Nero himself was responsible. He certainly took advantage of the resulting devastation of the city, building a lavish private palace on part of the site of the fire. Perhaps to divert attention from the rumors, Nero ordered that Christians should be rounded up and killed. Some were torn apart by dogs, others burnt alive as human torches. Over the next 100 years or so, Christians were sporadically persecuted. It was not until the mid-3rd century that emperors initiated intensive persecutions. This good news of their kingdom to be preached in all the inhabited earth. In Matthew chapter 10 verses 5 and 6 and chapter 15 verse 24, Jesus said this: These 12 Jesus sent forth, giving them these orders: Do not go off into the road of the nations, and do not enter into a Samaritan city, but instead go continually to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In answer, he said, I was not sent forth to any but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus asked his disciples to preach only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and he himself never preached outside of Israel. Later, he commanded his disciples to preach to the lost sheep of the house of Israel wherever they were scattered around the world. Matthew 28:19-20. Go therefore and make disciples of people of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all the things I have commanded you. And look, I am with you all the days until the conclusion of the system of things. When Jesus spoke to his Hebrew disciples, there was mostly the tribe of Judah and Benjamin living in Israel. The other 10 tribes had been banished centuries earlier, the people of the nations. Is there evidence that the gospel or good news was a targeted campaign to the Hebrews only? Colossians 1:21-23. Indeed, you who were once alienated and enemies because your minds were on the works that were wicked, he now has again reconciled by means of that one's fleshly body through his death, in order to present you holy and unblemished and open to no accusation before him, provided, of course, that you continue in the faith, established on their foundation and steadfast, and not being shifted away from the hope of that good news which you heard, and which was preached in all creation that is under heaven. Of this good news I, Paul, became a minister. Paul said under inspiration that the good news had been preached in all creation that is under heaven. It is well known that not every country in the world had been reached with their good news in the first century. Some suggest that Paul was talking about the known world to the Jews back then, but that did not explain why Paul could say that when under inspiration and God knew that not every country had been reached at that time. The simple answer is that the first century Christians who had been searching out the Jews only as directed by Jesus had indeed preached the good news to every country in the world where the Jews had settled at the time. This occurred before the destruction of the temple and the end of the Jewish system of things as prophesied by Christ. Let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Matthew 24:15-22. Therefore, when you catch sight of the disgusting thing that causes desolation, as spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in a holy place, let the reader use discernment. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Let the man on the housetop not come down to take the goods out of his house, and let the man in the field not return to the house to pick up his outer garment. Woe to the pregnant woman and those suckling a baby in those days. Keep praying that your flight may not occur in winter time, nor on their Sabbath day. For then there will be great tribulation such as has not occurred since the world's beginning until now, no, nor will occur again. In fact, unless those days were cut short, no flesh would be saved, but on account of the chosen ones, those days will be cut short. Jesus commanded his followers to flee to the mountains after seeing the Roman army besiege Jerusalem so completely that they stood in the holy place of the temple. It would have been difficult to see how they could flee in such circumstances until something unexpected occurred. The Romans retreated from the city for no known reason. An extract from Book 2, Chapter 19, Sections 6 and 7. The Romans retreat from Jerusalem. And now it was that a horrible fear seized upon their seditious, insomuch that many of them ran out of their city, as though it were to be taken immediately. But the people upon this took courage, and where their wicked part of the city gave ground, thither did they come, in order to set open the gates, and to admit Cestius as their benefactor, who, had he but continued the siege a little longer, had certainly taken the city. But it was, I suppose, owing to the aversion God had already at the city and the sanctuary, that he was hindered from putting an end to the war that very day. It then happened that Cestius was not conscious either how the besieged despaired of success, nor how courageous the people were for him, and so he recalled his soldiers from the place, and by despairing of any expectation of taking it, without having received any disgrace. He retired from the city without any reason in the world. But when the robbers perceived this unexpected retreat of his, they resumed their courage and ran after the hinder parts of his army and destroyed a considerable number of both their horsemen and footmen. And now Cestius lay all night at the camp which was at Sculpus, and as he went off farther next day, he thereby invited the enemy to follow him, who still fell upon the hindmost and destroyed them. They also fell upon the flank on each side of their army, and threw darts upon them obliquely. Nor durst those that were hindmost turn back upon those who wounded them behind, as imagining that the multitude of those that pursued them was immense. Nor did they venture to drive away those that pressed upon them on each side, because they were heavy with their arms, and were afraid of breaking their ranks to pieces, and because they saw the Jews were light, and ready for making incursions upon them. And this was the reason why the Romans suffered greatly, without being able to revenge themselves upon their enemies, so they were gored all the way, and their ranks were put into disorder. And those that were thus put out of their ranks were slain, among whom were Priscus, the commander of the 6th Legion, and Longinus, the tribune, and Emilius Secundus, the commander of a troop of horsemen. So it was not without difficulty that they got to Gabal, their former camp, and that not without the loss of a great part of their baggage. There it was that Cestius stayed 2 days, and was in great distress to know what he should do in these circumstances. But when on the 3rd day he saw a still much greater number of enemies, and all the parts round about him full of Jews, he understood that his delay was to his own detriment, and that if he stayed any longer there, he should have still more enemies upon him. The disgusting thing standing in a holy place. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 6, Section 1. Roman ensigns in the temple. And now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and of all the buildings lying round about it, brought their ensigns to the temple and set them over against its eastern gate, and there did they offer sacrifices to them, and there did they make Titus Imperator with their greatest acclamations of joy. And now all the soldiers had such vast quantities of the spoils which they had gotten by plunder, that in Syria a pound weight of gold was sold for half its former value. For then there will be great tribulation. An extract from Book 3, Chapter 10, Section 9. Lakes and rivers full of blood. But now, when the vessels were gotten ready, Vespasian put upon shipboard as many of his forces as he thought sufficient to be too hard for those that were upon the lake, and set sail after them. Now these which were driven into the lake could neither fly to the land, where all was in their enemy's hand, and in war against them, nor could they fight upon the level by sea, for their ships were small and fitted only for piracy. They were too weak to fight with Vespasian's vessels, and the mariners that were in them were so few that they were afraid to come near the Romans, who attacked them in great numbers. However, as they sailed round about the vessels, and sometimes as they came near them, they threw stones at the Romans when they were a good way off, or came closer and fought them. Yet did they receive the greatest harm themselves in both cases. As for the stones they threw at the Romans, they only made a sound one after another, for they threw them against such as were in their armor, while the Roman darts could reach the Jews themselves. And when they ventured to come near the Romans, they became sufferers themselves before they could do any harm to the either, and were drowned, they and their ships together. As for those that endeavored to come to an actual fight, the Romans ran many of them through with their long poles. Sometimes the Romans leaped into their ships with swords in their hands and slew them. But when some of them met the vessels, the Romans caught them by the middle and destroyed at once their ships and themselves who were taken in them. And for such as were drowning in the sea, if they lifted their heads up above the water, they were either killed by darts or caught by the vessels. But if, in their desperate case they were in, they attempted to swim to their enemies, the Romans cut off either their heads or their hands, and indeed they were destroyed after various manners everywhere. To the rest, being put to flight, were forced to get upon the land, while their vessels encompassed them about on the sea. But as many of these were repulsed when they were getting ashore, they were killed by the darts upon the lake, and the Romans leaped out of their vessels and destroyed a great many more upon the land. One might then see the lake all bloody and full of dead bodies, for not one of them escaped. And a terrible stink and a very sad sight there was on the following days over that country. For as for the shores, they were full of shipwrecks and of dead bodies all swelled. And as the dead bodies were inflamed by the sun and putrefied, they corrupted the air, insomuch that the misery was not only the object of commiseration to the Jews, but to those that hated them and had been the authors of that misery. This was the upshot of their sea fight. An extract from Book 5, Chapter 1, Section 3, Lakes and rivers full of blood. But now the tyrant Simon, the son of Jehovah, whom the people had invited in, out of the hopes they had of his assistance in the great distresses they were in, having in his power their upper city and a great part of their lower, did now make more vehement assault upon John and his party, because they were fought against from above also. Yet was he beneath their situation when he attacked them, and they were beneath the attacks of the others above them, whereby it came to pass that John did both receive and inflict great damage, and that easily, as he was fought against on both sides, and the same advantage that Eleazar and his party had over him, since he was beneath them, the same advantage had he, by his higher situation over Simon, on which account he easily repelled the attacks that were made from beneath, by the weapons thrown from their hands only, but was obliged to repel those that threw their darts from the temple above him by his engines of war, for he had such engines as threw darts and javelins and stones, and that in no small number, by which he did not only defend himself from such as fought against him, but slew moreover many of their priests, as they were about their sacred ministrations. For notwithstanding, these men were mad with all sorts of impiety, yet did they still admit those that desired to offer their sacrifices, although they took care to search the people of their own country beforehand, and both suspected and watched them, while they were not so much afraid of strangers who, although they had gotten leave of them, how cruel soever they were, to come into that court, were yet often destroyed by this sedition. For those darts that were thrown by the engines came with that force, that they went over all the buildings, and reached as far as the altar and the temple itself, and fell upon the priests and those that were about the sacred offices, insomuch that many persons who came thither with great zeal from the ends of the earth to offer sacrifices at this celebrated place, which was esteemed holy by all mankind, fell down before their own sacrifices themselves, and sprinkled that altar, which was venerable among all men, both Greeks and barbarians, with their own blood, till the dead bodies of strangers were mingled together with those of their own country, and those of profane persons with those of their priests, and the blood of all sorts of dead carcasses stood in lakes in the holy courts themselves. And now, O most wretched city, what misery so great as this didst thou suffer from the Romans, when they came to purify thee from thy intestine hatred? For thou couldst be no longer a place fit for God, nor couldst thou long continue in being, after thou hadst been a sepulchre for the bodies of thy own people, and hadst made the holy house itself a burying place in this civil war of thine. Yet mayst thou again grow better, if perchance thou wilt hereafter appease the anger of that God who is the author of thy destruction. But I must restrain myself from these passions by the rules of history, since this is not a proper time for domestical lamentations, but for historical narrations. I therefore return to the operations that follow in this sedition. An extract from Book 5, Chapter 11, Section 1, Jews Crucified. So now Titus's banks were advanced a great way, notwithstanding his soldiers had been very much distressed from the wall. He then sent a party of horsemen, and ordered they should lay ambushes for those that went out into the valleys to gather food. Some of these were indeed fighting men, who were not contented with what they got by rapine, but the greater part of them were poor people who were deterred from deserting by the concern they were under for their own relations, for they could not hope to escape away, together with their wives and children, without the knowledge of the seditious. Nor could they think of leaving these relations to be slain by the robbers on their account. Nay, the severity of the famine made them bold in thus going out. So nothing remained but that, when they were concealed from the robbers, they should be taken by the enemy. And when they were going to be taken, they were forced to defend themselves for fear of being punished, as after they had fought, they thought it too late to make any supplications for mercy. So they were first whipped, and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and were then crucified before the wall of the city. This miserable procedure made Titus greatly to pity them, while they caught every day 500 Jews. Nay, some days they caught more. Yet it did not appear to be safe for him to let those that were taken by force go their way, and to set a guard over so many he saw would be to make such as great deal them useless to him. The main reason why he did not forbid that cruelty was this, that he hoped the Jews might perhaps yield at that sight, out of fear lest they might themselves afterwards be liable to the same cruel treatment. So the soldiers, out of their wrath and hatred they bore the Jews, nailed those they caught, one after one way, and another after another, to their crosses, by way of jest, when their multitude was so great that room was wanting for their crosses, and crosses wanting for their bodies. An extract from Book 5, Chapter 13, Section 4, Their Great Slaughters. Hereupon some of the deserters, having no other way, leaped down from the wall immediately, while others of them went out of the city with stones, as if they would fight them. But thereupon they fled away to the Romans. But here a worse fate accompanied these than what they had found within the city, and they met with a quicker dispatch from the too great abundance they had among the Romans, than they could have done from the famine among the Jews. For when they came first to the Romans, they were puffed up by the famine, and swelled like men in a dropsy, after which they all on the sudden overfilled those bodies that were before empty, and so burst asunder, excepting such only as were skilful enough to restrain their appetites, and by degrees took in their food into bodies unaccustomed thereto. Yet did another plague seize upon those that were thus preserved. For there was found among the Syrian deserters a certain person who was caught gathering pieces of gold out of the excrements of the Jews' bellies. For the deserters used to swallow such pieces of gold, as we told you before, when they came out, and for these did the seditious search them all. For there was a great quantity of gold in the city, insomuch that as much was now sold in the Roman camp for 12 Attic drams, as was sold before for 25. But when this contrivance was discovered in one instance, the fame of it filled their several camps, that their deserters came to them full of gold. So the multitude of the Arabians, with the Syrians, cut up those that came as supplicants, and searched their bellies. Nor does it seem to me that any misery befell the Jews that was more terrible than this, since in one night's time about 2,000 of these deserters were thus dissected. An extract from Book 5, Chapter 13, Section 6, Their Great Slaughters. But as for John, when he could no longer plunder the people, he betook himself to sacrilege, and melted down many of the sacred utensils which had been given to the temple, as also were many of those vessels which were necessary for such as ministered about holy things, their cauldrons, their dishes, and the table. Nay, he did not abstain from those pouring vessels that were sent them by Augustus and his wife. For the Roman emperors did ever both honor and adorn this temple, whereas this man, who was a Jew, seized upon what were their donations of foreigners, and said to those that were with him, that it was proper for them to use divine things while they were fighting for their divinity without fear, and that such whose warfare is for the temple should live of their temple, on which account he emptied the vessels of that sacred wine and oil which the priests kept to be poured on their burnt offerings, and which lay in the inner court of the temple, and distributed it among the multitude, who, in their anointing themselves and drinking, used each of them above an hin of them. And here I cannot but speak my mind, and what their concerns I am under dictates to me, and it is this. I suppose that had the Romans made any longer delay in coming against these villains, their city would either have been swallowed up by the ground opening upon them, or been overflowed by water, or else been destroyed by such thunder as the country of Sodom perished by, for it had brought forth a generation of men much more atheistical than were those that suffered such punishments. For by their madness it was that all the people came to be destroyed. An extract from Book 5, Chapter 13, Section 7, The Great Slaughters. And, indeed, why do I relate these particular calamities? While Aeneas, the son of Lazarus, came running to Titus at this very time, and told him that there had been carried out through that one gate which was entrusted to his care, no fewer than 115,880 dead bodies in the interval between the 14th day of the month Xanthius, Nisan, when the Romans pitched their camp by the city, and the first day of the month Painimus, Tammuz. This was itself a prodigious multitude, and though this man was not himself set as a governor at that gate, yet was he appointed to pay the public stipend for carrying these bodies out, and so was obliged of necessity to number them, while the rest were buried by their relations, though all their burial was but this, to bring them away and cast them out of their city. After this man there ran away to Titus many of their eminent citizens, and told him the entire number of the poor that were dead, and that no fewer than 600,000 were thrown out at the gates, though still the number of the rest could not be discovered. And they told him further, that when they were no longer able to carry out the dead bodies of the poor, they laid their corpses on heaps in very large houses, and shut them up therein, as also that a medimnus of wheat was sold for a talent, and that when, a while afterward, it was not possible to gather herbs, by reason the city was all walled about. Some persons were driven to that terrible distress as to search their common sewers and old dunghills of cattle, and to eat the dung which they got there, and what they of old could not endure so much as to see they now used for food. When the Romans barely heard all this, they commiserated their case, while the seditious, who saw it also, did not repent, but suffered the same distress to come upon themselves, for they were blinded by that fate which was already coming upon the city, and upon themselves also. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 1, Section 1, The Desolation of Jerusalem. Thus did the miseries of Jerusalem grow worse and worse every day, and their seditious were still more irritated by the calamities they were under, even while the famine preyed upon themselves, after it had preyed upon the people. And indeed, the multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps one upon another was a horrible sight, and produced a pestilential stench, which was a hindrance to those that would make sallies out of their city and fight their enemy. But as those were to go in battle array, you had been already used to 10,000 murders, and must tread upon those dead bodies as they marched along. So were not they terrified, nor did they pity men as they marched over them, nor did they deem this affront offered to their deceased to be any ill omen to themselves. But as they had their right hands already polluted with the murders of their own countrymen, and in that condition ran out to fight with foreigners, they see to me to have cast a reproach upon God himself, as if he were too slow in punishing them. For the war was not now gone on with as if they had any hope of victory. For they gloried after a brutish manner in that despair of deliverance they were already in. And now the Romans, although they were greatly distressed in getting together their materials, raised their banks in 20 days, after they had cut down all the trees that were in the country that adjoined to the city, and that for 90 furlongs round about, as I have already related. And truly the very view itself of the country was a melancholy thing. For those places which were before adorned with trees and pleasant gardens were now become a desolate country every way, and its trees were all cut down, nor could any foreigner that had formerly seen Judea and the most beautiful suburbs of the city, and now see it as a desert, but lament and mourn sadly at so great a change, for there had laid all signs of beauty quite waste, nor, if anyone that had known the place before had come on a sudden to it now, would have known it again. But though he were at the city itself, yet would he have inquired for it notwithstanding. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 5, Section 1, Conflagration of their Holy House. While the Holy House was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Nor was there a commiseration of any age, or any reverence of gravity, but children and old men and profane persons and priests were all slain in the same manner, so that this war went round all sorts of men, and brought them to destruction, and as well those that made supplication for their lives, as those that defended themselves by fighting. Their flame was also carried a long way, and made an echo, together with the groans of those that were slain. And because this hill was high, and The works at their temple were very great. One would have thought that the whole city had been on fire. Nor can one imagine anything either greater or more terrible than this noise. For there was at once a shout of the Roman legions, who were marching all together, and a sad clamour of the seditious, who were now surrounded with fire and sword. The people also that were left above were beaten back upon their enemy, and under a great consternation, and made sad moans at their calamity they were under. The multitude also that was in the city joined in this outcry with those that were upon the hill. And besides, many of those that were worn away by the famine, and their mouths almost closed when they saw the fire of their holy house, they exerted their utmost strength, and brake out into groans and outcries again. Perea did also return he echo, as well as the mountains round about their city, and augmented the force of their entire noise. Yet was their misery itself more terrible than this disorder, for one would have thought that the hill itself, on which the temple stood, was seething hot, as full of fire on every part of it, that the blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those that were slain more in number than those that slew them. For the ground did nowhere appear visible for the dead bodies that lay on it, but the soldiers went over the heaps of these bodies, as they ran upon such as fled from them. And now it was that the multitude of the robbers were thrust out of the inner court of the temple by the Romans, and had much ado to get into the outer court, and from thence into the city, while the remainder of the populace fled into the cluster of that outer court. As for the priests, some of them plucked up from the holy house the spikes that were upon it, with their bases, which were made of lead, and shot them at the Romans instead of darts. But then, as they gained nothing by so doing, and as the fire burst out upon them, they retired to the wall that was 8 cubits broad, and there they tarried. Yet did 2 of these of eminence among them, who might have saved themselves by going over to the Romans, all have borne up with courage, and taken their fortune with the others, throw themselves into the fire, and were burnt together with the holy house. Their names were Marius, the son of Bogas, and Joseph, the son of Daleus. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 8, Section 2, Multitudes Sold into Bondage. It was at this time that the commanders of the Idumeans got privately together and took counsel about surrendering themselves up to the Romans. Accordingly, they sent 5 men to Titus and entreated him to give them his right hand for their security. So Titus, thinking that the tyrants would yield if the Idumeans, upon whom a great part of the war depended, were once withdrawn from them, after some reluctance and delay, complied with them and gave them security for their lives, and sent their 5 men back. But as these Idumeans were preparing to march out, Simon perceived it, and immediately slew the 5 men that had gone to Titus, and took their commanders, and put them in prison, of whom the most eminent was Jacob, the son of Sosas. But as for the multitude of the Idumeans, who did not at all know what to do, now their commanders were taken from them, he had them watched, and secured the walls by a more numerous garrison. Yet could not that garrison resist those that were deserting? For although a great number of them were slain, yet were the deserters many more in number. These were all received by the Romans, because Titus himself grew negligent as to his former orders for killing them, and because the very soldiers grew weary of killing them, and because they hoped to get some money by sparing them, for they left only the populace, and sold the rest of the multitude, with their wives and children, and every one of them at a very low price, and that because such as were sold were very many, and the buyers very few. And although Titus had made proclamation beforehand that no deserter should come alone by himself, so that they might bring out their families with them, yet did he receive such as these also. However, he set over them such as were to distinguish some from others, in order to see if any of them deserved to be punished. And indeed, the number of those that were sold was immense, but of the populace above 40,000 were saved, whom Caesar let go whither every one of them pleased. And extract from Book 6, Chapter 9, Section 2, the number of captives. And now, since his soldiers were already quite tired with killing men, and yet there appeared to be a vast multitude still remaining alive, Caesar gave orders that they should kill none but those that were in arms, and opposed them, but should take the rest alive. But together with those whom they had orders to slay, they slew the aged and the infirm. But for those that were in their flourishing age, and who might be useful to them, they drove them together into their temple, and shut them up within the walls of the court of their women, over which Caesar set one of his freedmen, as also Fronto, one of his own friends, which last was to determine everyone's fate, according to his merits. So this Fronto slew all those that had been seditious and robbers, who were impeached one by another. But of the young men he chose out the tallest and most beautiful, and reserved them for their triumph. And as for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds, and sent them to the Egyptian mines. Titus also sent a great number into their provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theatres by the sword and by the wild beasts. But those that were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. Now during the days wherein Fronto was distinguishing these men, there perished, for want of food, 11,000, some of whom did not taste any food, through the hatred their gods bore to them, and others would not take in any when it was given them. The multitude also was so very great that they were in want even of corn for their subsistence. An extract from Book 6, Chapter 9, Section 3, the number of captives. Now the number of those that were carried captive during the whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation, with the citizens of Jerusalem, but not belonging to the city itself, for they were come up from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army, which at the very first occasioned so great a straitness among them that there came a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterward such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly, and that this city could contain so many people in it is manifest by that number of them which was taken under Cestius, who being desirous of informing Nero of the power of the city, who otherwise was disposed to contemn that nation, entreated the high priests, if the thing were possible, to take the number of their whole multitude. So these high priests, upon the coming of their feast, which is called the Passover, when they slay their sacrifices, from the 9th hour to the 11th, but so that a company not less than belong to every sacrifice. For it is not lawful for them to feast singly by themselves. And many of us are 20 in a company. Found the number of sacrifices was 256,500, which, upon the allowance of no more than 10 that feast together, amounts to 2,700,200 persons that were pure and holy. For as to those that have the leprosy, or the gonorrhea, or women that have their monthly courses, or such as are otherwise polluted, it is not lawful for them to be partakers of this sacrifice, nor indeed for any foreigners neither, who come hither to worship. An extract from Book 7, Chapter 1, Section 1, Jerusalem demolished. Now as soon as the army had no more people to slay or to plunder, because there remained none to be the objects of their fury, for they would not have spared any, had there remained any other work to be done. Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and temple, but should leave as many of the towers standing as were of the greatest eminency, that is, Phasaelus, and Hippicus, and Mariam, and so much of the wall as enclosed the city on the west side. This wall was spared in order to afford a camp for such as were to lie in garrison, as were the towers also spared, in order to demonstrate to posterity what kind of city it was, and how well fortified, which the Roman valor had subdued. But for all the rest of the wall, it was so thoroughly laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to their foundation, that there was left nothing to make those that came thither believe it had ever been inhabited. This was the end which Jerusalem came to by the madness of those that were for innovations, a city otherwise of great magnificence and of mighty fame among all mankind. But on account of the chosen ones, those days will be cut short. The days was cut short when the Romans unexpectedly withdrew from Jerusalem. That allowed the chosen ones, the faithful disciples, to flee. Josephus's account of the surprise withdrawal of the Romans is covered in the section earlier headed, "Let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains." From Matthew 24 verses 23 to 28, Jesus warns about the false prophets, which have also already been covered by extracts from Josephus in their section. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many. Then Jesus says this in verse 27, "For just as the lightning comes out of eastern parts and shines over to western parts, so the presence of the Son of Man will be." Lightning is a bright, white, silvery light. Does Josephus mention a bright light that can be seen by all in Jerusalem? Yes, he does. This and other phenomena will be covered now. Matthew 24, verses 29 to 31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will beat themselves in lamentation. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet sound, and they will gather his chosen ones together from the four winds, from one extremity of the heavens to their other extremity. Sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Proponents who believe there must be a future, wider fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy base that assertion on their belief that the above phenomena did not occur in the first century. But Josephus' account begs to differ. The table below lists the phenomena that was witnessed according to Josephus. A star in the form of a sword, a long-lasting comet, a bright light shining around the altar and the temple, a vision of chariots and soldiers running around among the clouds and all cities of Palestine, a quaking, a great noise, the sounds of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." An extract from Book 4, Chapter 4, Section 5, Celestial and Other Phenomena. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, and did so plainly foretell their future desolation. But, like men infatuated, without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also, before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month Samphicus, Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round the altar and the holy house, that it appeared to be bright daytime, which light lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also, Yahawah, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass, and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone, was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now, those that kept watch in the temple came thereupon running to the captain of the temple, and told him of it. who then came out thither, and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open them the gate of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was opened for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that this signal foreshowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month Artemisius, Zaire, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Moreover, at that feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, in the first place, they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude, saying, "Let us remove hence." Let us recap these incredible phenomena seen and experienced by those in Jerusalem. 1. There was a comet moving above the city for a whole year. 2. There was a great light which shone around the altar and holy house for 30 minutes, that was bright even in the daytime. 3. Chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running among the clouds in Jerusalem and surrounding cities. 4. During Pentecost, in the inner courtyard, the priests felt a quaking and a great noise. 5. After the quaking and the great noise, they heard a sound of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." Yes, there is no mention of the sun literally being darkened, the moon not giving its light, and the stars falling from heaven. But we know that Jesus often used metaphors and symbolisms in his speeches, together with literalness. For instance, Matthew chapter 5, 27 to 29. You heard that it was said, you must not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone that keeps on looking at a woman so as to have a passion for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If now that right eye of yours is making you stumble, tear it out and throw it away from you. For it is more beneficial to you for one of your members to be lost to you than for your whole body to be pitched into Gehenna. Jesus here speaks about literal adultery, then symbolic adultery in the heart, then literally tearing your eye out, then throwing your body into a symbolic Gehenna. The signs in the sun, moon and stars could be about governments, authorities and those of influence within Jerusalem, because Jesus added, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. We know that heaven can mean rulership in the Bible. Haggai chapter 2 verses 6 and 7. For this is what Jehovah of armies has said. Yet once, it is a little while, and I am rocking the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry ground. And I will rock all the nations, and the desirable things of all the nations must come in. And I will fill this house with glory, Jehovah of armies has said. Of course, the literal heavens, earth, sea and dry ground were not rocked, but nations with their governments, authorities and citizens was. Sometimes the language that the Bible uses when prophesying is fulfilled in a manner that is different from the way the prophecy would be fulfilled if taken literally. Did the sign of the Son of Man appear in heaven as Jesus prophesied? Yes, it did. As Josephus wrote, there was a star in the sky above Jerusalem which was in the shape of a sword. He will send forth his angels with a great trumpet sound, and they will gather his chosen ones together from their four winds, from one extremity of the heavens to their other extremity. Could the great trumpet sound be what Josephus described earlier? A great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude, saying, let us remove hence. Was the chosen ones gathered from one extremity of the heavens to the other extremity? Yes. All the faithful disciples of Jesus who was in Jerusalem remembered his commandment to flee to the mountains after the Romans retreated from their city unexpectedly. The great noise and the sound of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence," would also have convinced their disciples to flee. So the one extremity to the other extremity appears to mean the faithful disciples was gathered from all areas of Jerusalem. All the tribes of the earth will beat themselves in lamentation, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. All the tribes of the earth that was in Jerusalem at the time of the tribulation was mainly the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin. We have read from the writings of Josephus that there was great lamentation in Jerusalem due to the massacres, robbery, betrayal, war, famine, destruction of the temple, and they saw the Son of Man in the sky, in the form of a sign of a star that resembled a sword. This generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur. Matthew 24 verses 32 to 35. Now learn from the fig tree as an illustration this point. Just as soon as its young branch grows tender and it puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. Likewise also you, when you see all these things, know that he is near at the doors. Truly I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Jesus gave the illustration of a fig tree. When it began to sprout, then one knew that summer was near. Likewise, when they saw all the things Jesus spoke about, then they would know that Jesus was near at the doors. Crucially, Jesus said their generation who was alive when he spoke those things would not pass away until all those things occurred. Yes, members of that first century generation only would still be alive when everything that Jesus prophesied would come true before they died. That means the prophecy was completely fulfilled in the first century, with no greater worldwide fulfillment to come that many Christians have been waiting for more than 2,000 years and counting. Remember, Jesus said this in Matthew 24, verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation such as has not occurred since the world's beginning until now. No, nor will occur again. The Great Tribulation on Jerusalem would be something that had not occurred before, nor will occur again. Yes, nothing like the tribulation on Jerusalem will ever occur again. That means there cannot be a greater fulfillment worldwide. In addition, Jesus said that generation would only be given the sign of Jonah, that he would be dead for 3 days but would be resurrected after that. That generation died thousands of years ago. Two men will be in the field. One will be taken along and the other be abandoned. Two women will be grinding at the hand mill. One will be taken along and the other be abandoned. Matthew 24, verses 36 to 42. Concerning that day and hour nobody knows, neither the angels of the heavens nor the Son, but only the Father. For just as the days of Noah were, so the presence of the Son of Man will be. For as they were in those days before the flood, eating and drinking, men marrying, and women being given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. And they took no note until the flood came and swept them all away. So the presence of the Son of Man will be. Then two men will be in the field. One will be taken along and the other be abandoned. Two women will be grinding at the hand mill. One will be taken along and the other be abandoned. Keep on the watch, therefore, because you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Jesus said during his presence that the Israelites would be getting on with their lives, eating and drinking and marrying, but taking no note of their preaching work as had Noah's generation. Then Jesus said there above. Some have interpreted this as a rapture. God is going to take some to heaven, but others will be left behind. But a simple explanation is linked to what Jesus said in Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16, where he said that when they caught sight of the disgusting thing standing in a holy place, then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. So, literally, the ones taken along was the ones that heeded the Lord's word and fled to the mountains. The ones abandoned was the ones who stayed behind and suffered their consequences. Also, Jesus mentioned women grinding at a mill. Those are activities which occurred in the first century. Would not Jesus have used a more generic phrase such as two women working if he meant his prophecy to have a wider fulfillment for modern times? Matthew 24 verses 43 to 44. But know one thing, that if the householder had known in what watch the thief was coming, he would have kept awake and not allowed his house to be broken into. On this account, you too prove yourselves ready, because at an hour that you do not think to be it, the Son of Man is coming. Jesus warns his listeners to keep awake and be ready because he would return at a time they are not expecting. Then he says in verses 45 to 47, who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics, to give them their food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on arriving finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings. When the sign of the Son of Man in the form of a sword appeared over Jerusalem, did Jesus find his apostles providing spiritual food? Yes. They wrote the Christian Greek scriptures, specifically the books predating the destruction of Jerusalem, including the letters from the Apostle Paul. Jesus concludes the section of his prophecy regarding the destruction of first century Jerusalem in verses 48 to 51. But if ever that evil slave should say in his heart, my master is delaying, and should start to beat his fellow slaves, and should eat and drink with their confirmed drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day that he does not expect, and in an hour that he does not know, and will punish him with the greatest severity, and will assign him his part with the hypocrites. There is where his weeping and the gnashing of his teeth will be. This was fulfilled on the disciples who did not heed Jesus' commandment to flee Jerusalem after the Romans suddenly left. Their weeping and gnashing of teeth was a result of either being enslaved by the Romans, starving from famine, or facing violent death. Conclusion. Christians for centuries have been misled into believing by the churches and Jehovah's Witnesses that the prophecy of Jesus detailing the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the Jewish system of things must have a greater fulfillment in the future, because some of the things Jesus spoke about supposedly did not occur in the first century. But Josephus has it on record that they did. Remember, This is what he wrote. 1. A comet moving above the city for a whole year. 2. A great light which shone around the altar and the holy house for 30 minutes, that was bright even in the daytime. 3. Chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor was seen running among the clouds in Jerusalem and surrounding cities. 4. During Pentecost in the inner courtyard, the priests felt a quaking and a great noise. 5. After the quaking and the great noise, they heard a sound of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." The so-called unfulfilled prophecies can be briefly explained as follows. 1. Good news preached in all the inhabited earth. This was fulfilled in the first century with a campaign that targeted the Hebrews only. Paul said the good news had been preached in all creation under heaven. That is, the lands where the Jews had settled. 2. The sun darkened, the moon not giving its light, stars falling to the earth, and the powers of the heavens shaken. These appear to be symbolic, as the Bible previously referred to peoples, nations, governments, and authorities as heavens, stars, moon, and sun. 3. Chosen ones gathered from one extremity of the heavens to the other extremity. These are the faithful disciples in Jerusalem who heeded Jesus' word and fled to the mountains. 4. All the tribes of the earth beating themselves and seeing the sign of the Son of Man. The sign of the Son of Man occurred in the form of a star resembling a sword. The tribes who remained in Jerusalem beat themselves in lamentation because they did not listen to Jesus and knew that violent death awaited them. 5. One taken and the other abandoned. Faithful disciples who heeded Jesus' words to flee to the mountains was taken, whilst those who remained in Jerusalem was abandoned. There are still outstanding prophecies that remain unfulfilled. Some of these are the tempest that God will release as he goes from nation to nation, punishing those who treated his people badly, and the gathering and settlement of the 12 tribes of Israel upon the soil of the land of Israel. Also, there are the events described in the book of Revelation.